In that quiet space between darkness and light, a simple act holds power far greater than most realize. It is not wealth that shapes how others see you, nor loud words, nor the force of authority. Respect is born from presence, and presence is shaped in the first moments of your day. There is an ancient morning practice, simple yet profound, the act of drinking water with full awareness at sunrise, not rushed, not distracted, but slow, intentional, and conscious, as if each sip is a reminder that life itself is entering you again. When you rise from sleep, your mind is like still water. In that stillness, whatever you do first becomes the tone of your entire day. If you begin with chaos, your energy scatters. If you begin with distraction, your focus weakens. But if you begin with awareness, something subtle changes within you. Your posture becomes grounded. Your gaze becomes steady. Your voice carries calm certainty, and people feel it before you even speak. Respect is not demanded, it is transmitted. When you perform this morning act with awareness, you are not just drinking water, you are training your presence. You are telling your mind that you are not a reaction to the world, but a conscious participant in it. And when a person moves through life without inner reaction, but with inner direction, others naturally adjust their behavior around them. Have you noticed how some people enter a room and the atmosphere settles? They do not announce themselves. They do not force attention. Yet something within them makes others listen more carefully, speak more thoughtfully, and behave more respectfully. That is not an accident of personality. It is the result of inner alignment. This morning practice becomes the seed of that alignment. Each day as you drink water in silence and awareness, you are strengthening three unseen forces: clarity of mind, stability of emotion, and dignity of presence. Clarity allows you to see without confusion. Stability prevents you from being shaken by others. Dignity ensures that your energy does not collapse in the presence of pressure. Over time, this changes how you walk. It changes how you listen. It changes how you respond when others challenge you. You stop chasing approval, and because of that, approval begins to follow you. Respect is not something taken from others. It is something reflected back when your inner world is ordered. And so each morning becomes a quiet ceremony. No noise, no urgency. Just awareness meeting life in its simplest form. A glass of water, a steady breath, a conscious beginning. Do this not to impress others, but to train the unseen foundation within you. Because when the foundation is strong, even silence becomes powerful. And when silence becomes powerful, respect is no longer requested, it is naturally given. Morning awareness sets your energy. The first moments after waking determine your mental clarity and emotional balance for the entire day. Before the world begins to speak loudly, before voices rise and responsibilities begin to pull at the mind, there exists a brief and sacred space in the early morning. In that space, the human being is not yet defined by roles, expectations, or reactions. It is in this quiet threshold between sleep and waking that the foundation of the entire day is silently formed. If one learns to enter this moment with awareness, then the moment is complete. Even the simplest action can become a source of inner strength that gradually shapes how the world responds in return. When a person wakes up and immediately rushes into noise, thoughts scatter like dust in wind. The mind becomes reactive, unstable, and easily influenced. But when the first act of the day is slow, conscious, and grounded, something subtle begins to shift inside. The breath becomes noticeable. The body becomes present, and the mind, instead of being pulled outward, begins to settle inward. In this state, even a glass of water is not just a physical need, it becomes a reminder of life itself entering the body again. Drinking water in the early morning with full awareness is a simple practice, yet its effect is deep. It is not the water alone that creates change, but the quality of attention given to it. When you hold the glass, there is a moment to pause. When you bring it closer, there is a moment to feel. When you drink it slowly, there is a moment to observe. These small pauses train the mind to stop rushing. And a mind that stops rushing begins to develop clarity. It begins to see things without distortion. It begins to respond instead of react. Over time, this practice becomes more than just a morning habit. It becomes a signal to the inner self that the day will not be led by chaos but by awareness. This silent agreement with oneself builds a kind of inner discipline that cannot be easily shaken by external circumstances. When challenges arise later in the day, the mind that has been trained in calmness does not collapse immediately. It remembers the stillness of the morning. It returns to balance more quickly. And in that balance there is strength. People often misunderstand respect as something that must be demanded through speech, position, or authority. Yet true respect is rarely a result of force. It is a response to presence. When a person carries inner stability, others feel it without explanation. There is a certain quiet dignity in such a person that does not need to announce itself. It is visible in the way they sit, the way they listen, the way they pause before speaking. This dignity is not built in moments of conflict, but in moments of solitude, especially in the first moments of the day. The morning practice of drinking water with awareness slowly begins to influence behavior beyond the ritual itself. It affects how a person speaks under pressure. It changes how they handle disagreement. It reduces unnecessary reaction. When the mind is not constantly jumping from thought to thought, the voice becomes calmer, and calmness naturally commands attention. People listen more carefully not because the words are louder, but because the energy behind them is steady. There is also a deeper transformation that occurs quietly. As this practice continues day after day, the need for external validation begins to weaken. A person no longer feels the constant urge to prove themselves. This absence of neediness creates a natural authority. Others sense this lack of dependence and respond with more respect, not because it is demanded, but because it is felt. In this way, a simple glass of water becomes more than hydration. It becomes a daily training of awareness, discipline, and inner order. And from that inner order arises something powerful, a presence that does not chase respect, yet receives it naturally. Conscious drinking of water builds presence. Drinking water slowly and mindfully at sunrise strengthens focus, grounding, and inner calm. As the morning unfolds in silence, there is a moment when life feels untouched, as if the world has not yet placed its weight upon the mind. In this delicate space, a human being has the rare opportunity to shape not only the day ahead, but also the deeper tone of their presence in life. What happens in these first few minutes after waking may appear small, even ordinary. Yet it carries a subtle influence that extends far beyond what most people recognize. When awareness is absent in the morning, the mind tends to scatter quickly into memories, worries, and expectations. The body may be awake, but the inner clarity is still asleep. In such a state, even simple interactions later in the day can feel heavy or reactive. Words come out faster than thought. Emotions rise without control, and gradually this lack of grounding affects how others perceive you. Not because they analyze you, but because energy is always felt before it is understood. But when the morning begins differently, when there is even a small pause before rushing into activity, the entire inner rhythm starts to change. A conscious moment with something as simple as water becomes a turning point. Holding the glass is no longer an automatic action. It becomes an awareness of touch, of presence, of being alive. Bringing it to the lips becomes an act of intention rather than habit. Drinking slowly becomes a way of returning to oneself before returning to the world. In this quiet act, the mind is gently trained to stop living in fragmentation. Instead of jumping into dozens of thoughts at once, it learns to remain in one experience at a time. This is where inner strength begins to form, not through force but through attention. And attention, when repeated daily, becomes discipline. Discipline, when deepened, becomes stability. And stability is what others unconsciously recognize as respect-worthy presence. There is a reason some individuals enter a space and immediately shift the atmosphere without saying much. It is not their appearance alone nor their status. It is the consistency of their inner alignment. Their presence does not fluctuate wildly with circumstances. They are not easily pulled into emotional extremes. This steadiness creates a feeling of reliability in others. People feel safer, calmer, and more attentive around them. This is where respect begins to grow naturally without effort. The early morning practice of mindful water drinking becomes a quiet foundation for this state. Each day it reminds the mind that awareness can be chosen. It shows that life does not have to begin in reaction. It can begin in observation. And when observation becomes the starting point, everything that follows carries more balance. Speech becomes measured, movement becomes intentional, decisions become clearer. Over time, this simple ritual creates a shift in identity. A person no longer sees themselves as someone who is controlled by external pressure. Instead, they begin to experience themselves as someone who can witness pressure without being consumed by it. This shift is subtle but powerful. It changes how they respond to criticism. It changes how they handle delay. It changes how they treat others in moments of tension. Respect in its truest form is not a reward for dominance. It is a reflection of inner coherence. When thoughts, emotions, and actions are aligned, there is no internal conflict leaking into behavior. And when there is no inner conflict, there is a natural calmness that others interpret as authority. Not forced authority, but quiet authority that does not need explanation. As days pass and this practice continues, something even more profound begins to happen. The urgency to be noticed slowly fades. The need to be validated by others loses its grip. And in that space, authenticity grows. A person becomes less concerned with how they appear and more connected to how they exist. This authenticity, untouched by pretense, is rare, and rarity naturally draws respect. In this way, the morning becomes more than a time of waking. It becomes a training ground for presence. A simple glass of water becomes a teacher of awareness. And from that awareness emerges a way of being that does not chase respect, yet consistently receives it because it is grounded in something far deeper than appearance or words. Respect comes from inner stability, not force. People naturally respect those who remain steady, calm, and undisturbed by external chaos. As the early morning settles into quietness, there is a subtle window of time where life feels unshaped, almost like a blank surface waiting for intention. In this window, the mind is highly impressionable, and whatever is placed into it first tends to influence the rhythm of the entire day. Most people overlook this moment, rushing immediately into thoughts, messages, and responsibilities. But those who understand the value of this transition between sleep and wakefulness know that it holds the power to define not only mood but also the depth of one's presence in the world. When the day begins without awareness, it often unfolds in fragments. Attention is divided, reactions become quicker than reflection, and energy is scattered across multiple directions. This scattered state does not just affect productivity, it affects presence. And presence is the invisible foundation upon which how others perceive you is built. People may not be able to explain why they respond to someone with attention or respect, but they always feel the quality of that person's internal state. In contrast, when the morning begins with even a single conscious act, something important is established. The act itself does not need to be complex. It is the quality of attention that matters. Sitting quietly, becoming aware of breath, and then slowly engaging with something as simple as drinking water becomes a way of signaling to the mind that the day will not be entered unconsciously. This small pause interrupts automatic thinking and creates space for clarity to arise. As water is taken in with awareness, there is an opportunity to experience simplicity in its purest form. There is no rush, no distraction, no fragmentation, just the act itself. In that simplicity, the mind begins to settle. Thoughts do not disappear, but they lose their urgency. Emotions do not vanish, but they become easier to observe without being carried away. This shift is subtle, yet it lays the groundwork for emotional balance throughout the day. Over time, this practice builds an internal rhythm that is no longer easily disrupted by external conditions. A person who begins their day in awareness carries a different quality of attention into every interaction. They are less likely to speak impulsively and more likely to listen fully. They respond rather than react. This difference may appear small, but it is deeply felt by others. People tend to trust calm presence because it signals stability, and stability is one of the core elements that generates respect naturally. Respect is often misunderstood as something that must be earned through performance or authority. But in reality, it is more closely linked to how grounded a person feels in themselves. When someone is internally scattered, their energy reflects inconsistency. Others may not consciously identify the cause, but they sense the instability. However, when a person is centered, even in silence, their presence communicates reliability. That reliability becomes the foundation of how respect is formed around them. The morning ritual of mindful water drinking gradually strengthens this centering. It trains the mind to stay in one place, even if only for a few moments. Those moments accumulate over time, shaping a personality that is less reactive and more observant. And observation creates space between stimulus and response. In that space lies choice, and in choice lies dignity. As this practice becomes consistent, the need for external validation begins to soften. A person starts to feel less dependent on approval because their internal state is no longer chaotic. When there is calm within, there is less hunger for recognition outside. This shift is powerful because it transforms the way one interacts with the world. Instead of seeking respect, a person begins to naturally express qualities that evoke it. In this way, the morning becomes a silent teacher. The act of drinking water becomes more than physical nourishment, it becomes a reminder of presence, clarity, and control over attention. And from that foundation grows a way of being that does not demand respect, yet consistently receives it, because it is rooted in awareness rather than effort. Your first action shapes your personality. Starting the day with awareness trains discipline, dignity, and controlled reactions over time. In the quiet hours of early morning, before the world fully awakens and begins to demand attention, there exists a rare opportunity for a human being to return to themselves. This moment is often overlooked, yet it holds a quiet power that shapes not only the mood of the day but also the deeper character of one's presence. When a person learns to inhabit this time with awareness, even the simplest action becomes meaningful, and even the most ordinary routine begins to transform the way they move through life. Most people wake and immediately allow their mind to be pulled outward. Notifications, thoughts, worries, and plans begin to compete for attention before clarity is even formed. In this state, the mind becomes reactive rather than centered. And a reactive mind tends to create reactive behavior. Speech becomes faster, patience becomes thinner, and emotional responses become less stable. Over time, this pattern affects how others experience you, even if they cannot clearly explain why. However, when the first moments of the day are approached differently, the entire internal landscape begins to shift. Instead of rushing into noise, there is a pause. In that pause, awareness is allowed to return. Breathing becomes noticeable again. The body is felt again. And in this simple return to presence, something fundamental is restored. The mind is no longer fully scattered into the external world, it begins to gather itself. Within this gathered state, even the act of drinking water becomes a practice of grounding. It is not the water alone that matters, but the attention given to it. Holding the glass becomes an act of awareness. Feeling its weight becomes a reminder of being present in the body. Drinking slowly becomes a deliberate slowing down of the inner pace. In this way, a basic necessity of life turns into a training of consciousness. As this practice is repeated each morning, it begins to create a subtle but powerful internal discipline. The mind learns that it does not need to immediately jump into thought or reaction. It learns that stillness is possible even if brief. And this small experience of stillness becomes a reference point that can be returned to throughout the day. When stress arises later, the memory of that calm beginning can soften the intensity of reaction. This inner stability gradually influences behavior in visible ways. A person who is internally steady tends to speak with more clarity. Their words carry less urgency and more weight. They do not feel the need to fill silence with unnecessary speech. They listen more fully because they are not rushing to respond. And in this quality of presence, others begin to notice something different. Not something loud, but something grounded. Respect in its natural form often grows from this kind of grounded presence. It is not something that is demanded through effort or position. Instead, it arises in response to how consistently stable a person feels to others. When someone does not fluctuate excessively in mood or reaction, people around them unconsciously feel more at ease. And ease creates trust. Trust over time becomes respect. The morning practice of mindful water drinking becomes the quiet foundation of this stability. It may appear insignificant from the outside, but internally it acts as a reset point. It reminds the mind that the day does not have to begin in chaos. It shows that awareness can be chosen even in the smallest of actions. And when awareness becomes a choice at the start of the day, it becomes easier to choose it again in more complex situations. With time, something even deeper begins to unfold. The constant need for approval begins to weaken. The mind becomes less dependent on external validation because it is no longer internally unstable. When a person feels centered within themselves, they naturally become less concerned with how they are perceived. This absence of inner insecurity creates a quiet confidence that others can feel. In this way, the morning becomes a foundation for character rather than just a beginning of routine. A simple glass of water becomes a symbol of presence. And from that presence grows a way of being that does not seek respect, yet naturally receives it, because it is rooted in calm awareness rather than external effort or force. True influence is silent and natural. Respect is not demanded through words or power, but is reflected from a person's composed presence and behavior. In the earliest hours of the day, when silence still rests gently over everything and the world has not yet fully awakened into its noise and demands, there is a hidden doorway into awareness that most people walk past without noticing. This doorway is not physical, yet it is always present. It exists in the small gap between sleep and full waking consciousness. In that gap, the mind is still soft, still impressionable, still capable of being shaped by intention rather than habit. What a person does in this moment may appear small on the surface, but inwardly it can influence the entire architecture of their day and, over time, the way they are perceived by others. When waking becomes automatic, the mind immediately attaches itself to urgency. Thoughts of tasks, problems, conversations, and expectations begin to rush in like an unorganized stream. In such a state, the inner world becomes fragmented. Attention is divided, awareness is scattered, and emotional balance becomes fragile. A person may not realize it, but this fragmentation slowly affects their presence. It shows in their tone, their reactions, their patience, and even in the way they carry themselves in silence. Yet when the first moments after waking are treated with care, a very different foundation is created. Instead of allowing the mind to be pulled outward immediately, there is a conscious pause. In this pause, the simplest awareness returns. Breath is felt again without effort. The body is noticed again without judgment. The fact of being alive becomes clear before anything else is added on top of it. This return to simplicity is not dramatic, but it is deeply stabilizing. In this quiet state, even the act of drinking water becomes more than just a routine. It becomes a deliberate act of grounding. The glass is not just an object, but a point of focus. The movement of lifting it is not rushed, but observed. The sensation of water entering the body is not ignored, but acknowledged. This attention transforms a basic necessity into a form of training for the mind. It teaches the individual to slow down internally, even when life outside may eventually speed up. As this practice is repeated day after day, it begins to reshape the inner rhythm of a person. The mind gradually learns that not every impulse needs immediate action. Not every thought needs instant expression. There is space available between stimulus and response, and within that space lies the beginning of real self-control. This does not suppress emotion or thought, it simply prevents them from becoming chaotic. With time, this quiet discipline begins to reflect outwardly. The way a person speaks becomes more measured. Their words carry a sense of calm intention rather than emotional reaction. They begin to listen more fully instead of preparing their response while others are still speaking. This quality of attention creates a noticeable shift in how others experience them. People often feel more understood, more respected, and more at ease in their presence, even if they cannot explain why. Respect in its natural form does not arise from force or demand. It emerges from consistency of presence. When someone remains relatively steady across changing situations, others begin to trust that steadiness. Trust, once established, quietly transforms into respect. It is not given because it is asked for, but because it is felt as a response to inner stability. The morning practice of mindful water drinking becomes the subtle root of this stability. It is not the act itself that holds power, but the consciousness applied to it. By beginning the day with awareness instead of reaction, the mind is gently reminded that it has the ability to choose its state rather than be controlled by circumstances. This realization, repeated daily, becomes internal strength. Eventually, something even more profound begins to happen. The dependence on external validation starts to weaken. When inner chaos decreases, the need for outer approval also decreases. A person becomes less driven by the desire to be seen and more anchored in simply being present. This shift brings a quiet confidence that does not need display. In this way, a simple morning ritual becomes a silent architect of character. A glass of water becomes a teacher of awareness. And from that awareness grows a presence that does not chase respect, yet naturally receives it because it is built upon calm, consistency, and inner order rather than effort or appearance.